Welcome to Artificiality, the podcast from Helen and Dave Edwards from Sonder Studio. We created Sonder Studio to empower humans in our complex age of machines, data, and AI. Through our strategy, innovation, and change services, we help organizations activate the collective intelligence of humans and AI. We work with leaders in tech, data, and analytics to co-create AI strategies, design innovative AI products and services, and craft change management programs that help their people succeed in an AI-powered, data-centric, complex world. We leverage the new world of foundation models, generative AI, and low-code environments to create an amplified human-machine experience centered on machines that can be a mine for our minds. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com. AI is based on data, and data is frequently collected with the intent to be quantified, understood, and used across context. That's why we have things like grade point averages that translate across subject matters and educational institutions. That's why we perform cost-benefit analyses to normalize the forecasted value of projects, no matter the details. As we deploy more AI that is based on a metrified world, we're encouraging the quantification of our lives and risk losing the context and subjective value that creates meaning. In this interview, we talk with Thi Nguyen about these large-scale metrics, about objectivity and judgment, about how this quantification removes the nuance, contextual sensitivity, and variability to make these measurements legible to the state. And that's just scratching the surface of this interview. Thi Nguyen used to be a food writer and is now a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. His research focuses on how social structures and technology can shape our rationality and our agency. He writes about trust, art, games, and communities. His book, Games, Agency as Art, was awarded the American Philosophical Association's 2021 Book Prize. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you today.
Hello.
How about you start off and tell us a bit about your path to philosophy?
Yeah, I had a kind of strange path to philosophy. I didn't expect to be a philosopher. I thought I was going to be a biologist or into evolutionary biology or maybe into English literature. But my high school English teacher gave me a copy of Kuhn's Structures of Scientific Revolution. It totally blew my mind. And then I went to college and I tried being a history of science major because Kuhn was a historian of science. And I quickly figured out that the stuff I was into was all the philosophy of science, about what objectivity was and how we figured things out about the world. And the historical material I couldn't quite cope with. And then my professor, my seminar leader, ended up taking me aside and basically saying T, I hate to break it to you, I don't think you're a historian. I think you're into the philosophy. And I was like, crap.
What do I do now? That's a fantastic story because, anyone at a young age that got given that book, I think it either blew your mind or you just weren't a scientist of any sort. And you must find that there's a never been a bigger call for us to understand the nature of knowledge, especially with large language models and everyone having debates about, well, do they understand? And is this the seeds of artificial intelligence, general intelligence, and how will we ever know truth again?
I do feel given the kind of stuff I do and the nature of knowledge and the nature of the social generation of knowledge, I feel like my little branch of philosophy has been toiling away in a back corner and everyone's ignoring us. And suddenly at this moment, people are calling us. They're like, what do you think about misinformation crises, conspiracy theories, large language models? And we're all scattering like roaches in the light, being like, oh God, we didn't know people would be interested.
Who knew philosophers could be so popular?
Who knew? I thought they just killed us when we talked to the youth.
So what do you say to them at the moment? If someone calls you and says, what's your perspective? Well, we have. What is your perspective on do these large language models contain hidden truths about, human knowledge, or how are we going to use this historical sort of imitative cultural technology to take us forward into the future? How are you sort of unpacking the discourse at the moment around generative AI?
Right. So I should say I am not an expert in machine learning at all. I've just kind of, because of the stuff I do on metrics and gamification, I've kind of like hung around people. One thing I should say is I have some things to say about other kinds of generative AI, about other kinds of machine learning, but ChatGPT, I just don't understand. So let me just shelve that, because I don't you should talk to someone else about that. A lot of the other training methodologies I find really strikingly worrisome because of the way they embed a target. So a lot of machine learning. So, okay, first I'm going to talk a little bit as a non-expert about what I vaguely know, and then I'll talk about the stuff that I actually know about. So a lot of machine learning training protocols look something like this. You can actually probably tell me more about this than I know, but you have a model, you introduce some variations into it, you run the variations, and then you see which one does better against some target, right? You see which one can generate better by you create a model, and then you see if you can hit a target, and then what we're looking for is a definition of the target. So, for example, Sina Fazlpour, this AI ethicist, spent some time talking about the process of training a model to predict student success, which gets used for admissions and gets used for interventions. Now, here's the question. How do you define student success, right? Because you're training a model and you're picking a model that most accurately predicts student success. So it turns out in a lot of the actual cases we have, student success got fixed by a small number of administrators and typically was specified as something like dropout rate and graduation rate. Nothing about student happiness, nothing about enrichment, nothing about, right? In some of the models,
nothing about what they go on to do.
Right, right. So a lot of the worry is that in a lot of cases, AIs are being trained to hit a very narrow human specified target. And often that human specified target is subject to the constraints of large scale data collection, right? So here are easy things that we can train an AI to predict: dropout rate, graduation speed, GPA. You could even do it for like postgraduate employment or salary. Here are things that's really hard to train to have a large data set on: satisfaction, increasing intellectual humility, increasing curiosity, increasing creativity, right? And one of the things
civic engagement.
Right. Civic engagement. So one of the worries is that the training, because of the way that the training procedure depends on a very clear quantified target, and because there are institutional and scale limitations on the kind of large-scale data sets we have that can train the machine, that means that there are lots of targets that we can't really effectively train for.
Yeah, and some of your work sort of suggests too that like this question mark comes up about, does the fact that you can't mathematize something give you information about how important that actually is? Right. Like, does some of what we care about it because it is subtle, because it is hard to measure, because we can't turn it into math? Is there something there that's interesting that AI researchers should be grappling with a little bit more? And the rest of us should be saying, that tells us something about what humans care about.
I mean, I think there are two different things to ask about. One is whether it's quantifiable in principle, whether God could quantify it. I kind of have no idea about that question. The other question is about what we as humans in human-sized institutions constrained by the kind of bureaucratic constraints that we're all kind of familiar with, what we can collect data on. And I think there's a lot of reason to think that that second category of institutionally constrained data collection does have a huge amount of stuff that it's going to leave out that we're going to care about. So let me give you the simplest version of this. I can't believe we're already straight into this material. So Theodore Porter, who's a historian of science, and a historian of quantification culture, who's really influenced by a bunch of philosophers like Ian Hacking. Theodore Porter has this great book called Trust in Numbers. And he's trying to understand the centrality of quantified information. And he's not interested in like science versus subjectivity. In particular, he's interested in how large-scale organizations, especially political and bureaucratic organizations, will get obsessed with metrics and rankings, even if they know that they're not great. Right? Even when we know that they're not tracking exactly what's important, even though we know that GPA doesn't capture everything about education. So he says there's this deep difference between qualitative and quantitative information. Qualitative information is nuanced and subtle and context sensitive and variable, but it travels really badly between people with different backgrounds and across different contexts. He says quantified information, again, not in principle, but the way quantified information shows up in institutions, has been prepared to travel between contexts. And the way we do that is we create a regular kernel that's context invariant, and then we all collect into that kernel. And because we've standardized that kernel, it can aggregate. So that's a really abstract way of putting it. But the easiest way to think about it is qualitative evaluations of your work in education versus a letter grade, right? I will write on my students' essays all kinds of complexities about how they're working, how this paper compared to the last one, given their life goals. I'll give like people that want to be journalists and people that want to be academics completely different evaluations. A lot of that stuff is not going to be comprehensible across the university, right? Not even outside the university. Like the business dean has no, I think, context for understanding my philosophical evaluations. And I have no context for understanding like a statistics professor's evaluations of their students. So instead we create this thing, the GPA, which is a super simple scale, right? And that makes sense across contexts. So one way to put it is the thing that makes quantified scales work in institutions, this context, this removal of context variability, this creation of a fixed standardized category, that's exactly what makes them non-responsive to new and changing contexts.
Because it's baked in, basically. You trade off scale and interpretability for the nuance of context, the applicability in particular situations.
I mean, that's exactly it. And you also change, what's really interesting is you change like, some of it is contextuality, and others of it is just the embeddedness in a fixed infrastructure. So Bowker and Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Leake Starr have this incredible book called Sorting Things Out. It's a history of standardization and categories. And one of the things they point out is that to make a category work in an institution, you have to fix it. And that means that you can't, simple example again. If I had a student who worked super hard and then had a family problem and their grade dropped a little bit, but they were really original and then their grade was really good and then like they just didn't turn in the last thing, I can't append that as a note to their grade in a way that will be visible to an outside employer, right? I mean, I can put it in their file somewhere, but that's going to get lost because the information collection system has not been prepared to admit that information. Right. So information.
You couldn't have picked a better example.
Right.
That's been our week.
Yes, we have. Yeah. We do have a child who is in that particular position at the moment,
now,
or sort of similar. Yeah, we totally get it. It's very personal.
Totally understand.
Right. You can't append the special circumstance that's actually important, and is actually like a key part of that individual's path. There is no way to put that. The grade is what the grade is. It's taken from a letter to a number, and then the number is calculated into the GPA. That's just it.
So this is one way to work, let me give you the philosopher's summary. I think one way to put it is that this is no accident. The very reason that kind of quantification works well in institutions is because it's been decontextualized. And so as you said, it gets scale, right? When you decontextualize and you aggregate, that you create a kind of universal language that crosses different contexts. But to do that, you have to shave off. One of the things I have this paper. I'm not sure if you've seen this paper, Transparency is Surveillance. So
the trust and transparency that riffing off of Onara O'Neill, is that?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. One of the things I think that's really interesting there is what we're kind of up against is the pressure of mass understandability. And what's on the other side of that pressure is expertise and sensitivity. So this really shows up in systems of public transparency, right? Because, here's the situation I was in. I was in charge of learning outcomes for my last philosophy department, which means finding a quantification that makes sense to the Utah State Legislature, who, of course, are constantly convinced that the humanities, and especially philosophy, is full of bullshit. So there are things that I can tell that my students have gotten better at, that I have been trained to, like, they're better at argument, they're better at critical thinking, they're better at reflectiveness. There's not a way for me to find a scale that anyone can use that's objective in a particular sense. I want to flag that. We should talk about what objective means, because this is the key. This is what you want a philosopher on your show for. The worry is there's a sense of objectivity, which means that anybody can check and repeat how that measurement went, right? And so a lot of the things I just mentioned, humility, reflectiveness, there's not a kind of institutionally objective way to measure that. And so if we prioritize the kinds of things that are mechanically collectible, standardized test scores, graduation rate, salary, then we're going to lose all that other stuff, because that's the stuff that takes some kind of expertise or sensitivity to tell.
So objectivity.
Yeah.
Let's ask you about that, because I want to know.
Okay.
What you're thinking.
And by the way, we do have Trust in Numbers, like that book.
Yes.
We have that book. Yes. Yeah. So I'm just, next time you feel like you need to read something.
Yes.
It's upstairs.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
That book is so good. By the way, the middle of that book is these are words most people don't believe, but a riveting history of the rise of the cost-benefit analysis. It's exactly.
You sure that's not an oxymoron?
No, it's so interesting. Actually, this is good. We should talk about this, because this will segue perfectly into talking about objectivity. It's the same thing I was just talking about. So one of the things that he says is there's this question about why we have this thing, the cost-benefit analysis, and it arose out of the American Army Corps of Engineers. And what he ends up saying is people think, they have this potted story that's like, engineers like numbers, so they must have done the cost-benefit analysis. That's not the history. The Army Corps of Engineers actually used to do complex qualitative evaluations about how a project would change the culture, the environment, people's way of life. But Congress would accuse them of nepotism and pork barreling because their judgments weren't kind of mechanical and formulaic. And so the Army Corps of Engineers came up with the cost-benefit analysis, where you estimate the economic expenditure and the economic benefit, and you tot it up and you give people a single number in order to ward off accusations of bias from Congress, because that kind of justification was inspectable by a non-expert. So this is really useful for talking about objectivity. So there are lots of things that objectivity could mean. I think there's a sense in which what we mean is, like, if something is objective versus subjective, like that it's a mind-independent reality, right? That there's something outside of us that just doesn't depend on our emotions. That's one sense of objective. There's another sense of objective that's really important. And that sense of objective is, so Porter calls it mechanically objective. What this means is that anybody could repeat the procedure. There's a nearby notion called legal objectivity. And legal objectivity is, what it is to be legally objective is that a law is such that when applied by different people will yield the same result in the same case.
So not noisy.
What'd you say?
So not noisy, not variable.
Oh, yeah. No, that's an interesting way to put it. So let me give you a case. And I don't quite know the language of noisy and variable, but and so does this make sense? The notion of mechanical objectivity and legal objectivity is actually really different from the notion of like objective truth, right? There might be objective truths that aren't mechanically objective, right? And there might be legal things that are legally objective that aren't tracking what we care about. So, for example, think about the age of maturity, right? So the things that we want. When do people get to drink alcohol? When can they give legal consent? When can they vote? What that stuff should probably be tied to is some complex assessment of someone's maturity and reasoning ability, right? But that's not something that is mechanically objective or legally objective. So instead, we create this really simple line. We have two in America, like 18 and 21, right? So those don't require judgment, right? But they will be applied in the same way to the same people. So to get this kind of, does it make sense? Like mechanical and public objectivity, we have to like take the standard and disconnect it from what we actually really care about because it's kind of hard to repeat. And then we have to connect it to something that's much more obvious, a line like how many years have you been around? So in many cases, mechanical objectivity and legal objectivity trade away connection to what we actually care about and get instead public repeatability. So does that track your notion of noise and variability?
Yeah, well, it takes out the judgment. And the judgment isn't just the assessment of the facts and whether they're relevant or weighting different things. It's also how someone feels at any given point in time. Like, am I annoyed enough with this 18-year-old to say that you're not an adult today?
Yep.
You don't have that part of the judgment, which I think is like what a lot of what we sort of consider around this new kind of style of AI is seeing how much it's pulling apart all of these things. Like you said something about you said something that made me think about language and the large language models, or even the creative and the artistic models. They're never the same twice. They don't produce like a mid-journey. You can put something, and you get this variability all the time. And the way that you judge that creativity moves around with the output that you get. And it sort of there's no real sense in your own mind of objectivity versus subjectivity. It's just all sort of become this kind of mashup. And I'm just sort of curious about how we think about like creativity and the way that we respond to these moving, changing, but still mathematical things. They're still using math to produce these outcomes that now aren't as sort of tightly codified as they were.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about how Midjourney works. What I know is that, so here's a case of what I'm sure about, and then I'll say something like, you can tell me how Midjourney works. So I remember a few years ago sitting in on a conference about building creative models. And again, there's this target setting procedure, right? And one of the things I heard a lot of people say was something like, oh, we're making a creative model that can generate scripts for new Netflix shows. And I was like, so what's your target? They're like, we're training it to make good art. I'm like, how are you operationalizing good art? And they said engagement hours. And I was like, that's not, there are a lot of, we're back at the same problem before, right? Like I know that's something that we have a large data set to, and one that's easily mechanically collectible, but it's not, right?
It doesn't have the meaning that we would consider around what is good art.
Yeah.
The meaning guy here.
Right. No, it doesn't have all this. So this goes back to, can I just go back for a second to something you said a little bit ago about, I think you said something that that really resonates with me, which is the claim that when you remove judgment, you get rid of, someone being in a bad mood. And I think that's exactly, here's exactly the worry. We have this thing that we call judgment, which doesn't proceed by some kind of formula or algorithm. It's non-mechanical. Judgment is the place where bias can sneak in, and judgment is the place where weird emotions can sneak in, but it's also the place where expertise and sensitivity reside, right? Like that's in this mysterious box called judgment. And the worry I have that's in that paper, Transparency Surveillance, is that what we should actually be doing is realizing that judgment is this complex thing. But what we're actually doing is being so worried about getting rid of bias and corruption that we're trying to remove all judgment from various procedures. And we're getting to a place where we can be sure that there was no emotional bias, but we might also have eliminated various forms of judgment, various forms of sensitivity, and various forms of expertise. The other thing that a lot of us worry about is how a lot of large scale systems eliminate individual bias, but incorporate systemic biases. So to give you an example, so here's a simple example from the educational world. So it used to be that college admissions were much more an individual basis. You met someone, you decided whether they're creative, they decided whether they were whatever, right? People started worrying that's super biased, and it was a very biased procedure. So a lot of the times you might change over to something like SATs. One of the interesting things is, though the SATs are mechanically applicable, they also contain a bias. It's harder to see. So one of the things we know is that basically SAT scores are highly indicative of economic, of how rich you were when you were a kid, and how good, which changes how well you take multiple choice tests. So there's this weird way in which the trying to find a mechanical mode of judgment often introduces other forms of bias in, just because of what's required, the kind of filters we have up that are introduced by the need to have a mechanical form of judgment.
Do you have a metaphor or a model in your mind for this as sort of a general thing? Like, it doesn't feel like it's quite a whack-a-mole. It feels more like it's a frontier of human gaming that's sort of powered by power, that's powered by sort of essential asymmetries in the way that people can deploy resources. That when you, for example, put in place in a university that the target is graduation rate, acceptance rate, just those sort of measures, the people who succeed are the ones who are really, really good at solving for that. When you put CEOs in, the people who succeed are the ones who are really, really good at earnings calls.
Yep.
and those. How do we kind of think about these? This is more of a dynamic, complex system where the metric isn't just about being gamed or being targeted. It's sort of beyond. I think it's Goddard's law, is it? that it's actually a system where everything's sort of moving and changing around these different cruxes in the overall complex system. Do you have a mental model for the general patterns there, or words to describe some of that stuff?
I mean, you're asking about the stuff that I've been thinking about intensely for the last 2 years. And if I had a ready answer to your question, my next book would be written, but it's not. So let me can I take a few stabs? I know exactly the thing you're talking about. So let me try a few things. One thing that we notice is that one of the things you want for a metric is transparency, right? You want to know exactly how it's measured. And a metric can't measure everything. So once you've announced what the metric measures, people just seem to aggressively game it, right? They can just target that. And insofar as that doesn't capture everything, right, then to put it in your terms, you're rewarding people that are willing to blot out everything else and just focus on this one thing that's measured. So there's a great example of this in this book I love. The sociologists Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter have this book called Engines of Anxiety, which is a study of how the U.S. News and World Report law school rankings change everything about the law schools. And they don't measure a lot of things, right? The key for the U.S. News and World Report is most of those rankings are incoming class GPA, incoming class LSAT score, outgoing class employment rate of the 9-month mark. And that's incredibly gameable, right? You can target students who have high LSAT scores, even if that doesn't serve some larger mission, right? So one of the things they talk about is, in many cases, a lot of law schools had to abandon community outreach to poorer students, because poorer students often, even though the law schools knew internally that poorer students, once they received enough support, often did really well, those students incoming didn't have high GPA, high LSAT scores, right? So in some sense, okay, let me step a little bit to the side. So at the end of my book on games, one of the things I get really interested in is what bad things might get exported from games. I think there's a lot of good things we can learn from games. And a lot of people worry that what games we should worry about games is like graphical violence. But I think most of the empirical evidence shows that people don't export that from games because they know it's a fiction. They know it's a fantasy. But what I'm actually worried we export from games is a particular attitude. And the attitude in a game is this. A game tells you, here's what you're aiming for. It's very thin. It's very clear. It's quantifiable. Here's the measure. Now ignore everything else in the world. Nothing is important. You can instrumentalize everything in the world and use it to get points, right? You get this attitude. I think I call it the all instrumentalizing attitude, where you're narrowly focused on an external point system and you're willing to use everything to get there. So here's a worry.
It's obsessive. You obsess.
Right. It's obsessive and it's thin. So one way to put it is, in these systems in which the majority of rewards or incentives are tied to a single clear metric, then you're rewarding people, as you say, who can hyper-focus on the metric and ignore everything else. Like one of the things, have you noticed that stuff on Amazon is just getting shittier?
Yeah.
And so
a lot shittier.
Here's the theory. Over time, what's happened is people that do on Amazon are throwing all their resources at optimizing the ranking algorithm and getting their product high, and not spending their resources making a good product, because sales are tied to the algorithm, and that's a much, much thinner thing to target. So same thing. So that's one version of the dynamic. I've got more, but I should pause.
I'm looping here. Sorry, I've been quiet here as I've been thinking about this decontextualization. I know I'm sort of rewinding a bit, but this sort of decontextualizing in order to get to a metric, the striving for an objective evaluation, and that sort of impact that it has on everything that's datafied, which means that if we're trying to, make a data-driven decision or do anything else like that, we're trying to gain anything that's coming out of AI systems, all of that is relying on things that have been quantified, which is therefore being decontextualized. And we talk about how one of the major gaps for AI is that it doesn't have an ability to see things in context. Well, it makes a lot of sense based on, this narrative that we're talking about here. But everything that we experience, or I'm sitting here wondering, which is not necessarily the most valuable thing we're doing as a podcast host, but that's where my mind is gone, is of all of the things that matter to me in my life that are impossible to quantify, that are impossible to decontextualize, right? So, and even if you think about, start with the things that are numerical, like look at value of a company. And, you can look at the earnings per share, and you can have a multiple and all those metrics. I get all that, worked in that world. But where are some of the most valuable things? Brands, right? So Nike or Apple, like the value of that business, you can't quantify the brand. People try, but really you can't. You can sort of see where that brand comes through in the financials. But move out of that. Like, what matters when you ask somebody, well, what's the best band ever in the world? Or where's your favorite place to go? Or why did you move to the house you're in and the neighbor you're in? Who's your favorite person? None of those things are actually, you can't find a metric for it. You could try, but really you can't describe it. It's all qualitative, right? Well, I just love the way that those lyrics speak to me. And that's what really matters. So when you're sitting here, we're talking about using AI to be creative. Well, how does that come through? None of that value of what I truly aspire to and want when I'm searching for music to listen to, that actually isn't present in the data. That value isn't there. Maybe you could look at how many times I've listened to a song, but that's actually that doesn't even represent it. I'm kind of stuck in this loop here that I'm loving that you brought it up, because I like being mired in this little loop here of this decontextualization. But I understand why we've done it. We want to have a metric, and we want to be able to measure things, and that's the
and we want that bias, scale,
and we want that scale. But then how do we add the context back in?
So this is, that's actually a great way to get at another of these images that Helen was asking about. But I should back up and say, okay, let me be clear about what I know and what I don't. The stuff I'm telling you is about how large-scale institutions collect data, how that data gets used, whether or not you can get past. So there's a thought in machine learning that even if certain kinds of contexts have been stripped from the data, sufficiently advanced machine learning algorithms can figure out what that is, even though it's missing from the data. That is something I have no idea about. So I have no clue. The thing I can say is that we can be a little bit clearer about what's being stripped out. There are a few different things that are being stripped out. This is not a binary where it's also, but you can see the kinds of institutional forces that strip out a few different things. One is that you tend to strip out things that are highly variable between contexts, and you tend to look for things that are context invariant. Another is you tend to strip out the kinds of things that require expertise or sensitivity to notice. And that might not be the same as context variability. So you might think, look, musical creativity, that might not be, the musical creativity is, maybe that's context invariant. Maybe that's just something that any musician can tell, but it's something different, right? Or requires a certain sensitivity and a certain expertise to see that kind of creativity. So you have two kind of forces moving at once. One force is the force of decontextualization, and the other is the force of de-expertising. And both these forces, I think, you get pushed to when you have a scaled system that has to communicate across different expertises. Does that make sense? So if you have a large scale system, then you can't promote, and you need everyone in that system to understand a particular metric. You can't use a very narrow expertise in constructing that metric. So those kind of two forces for me are this perfect storm of denuancing. Maybe that's the phrase for it, right? So yeah, that's the problem with large scale metrics, but you can see that problem arise precisely because of what they're for. It's not an accident, right? They are things that are meant to be collected by a large number of people, where the collection procedure can be understood by a large number of people, and then the output can be understood by a large number of people. So those are all forces. Those are all forces of simplification. I think the other way to put the image is: do you two know James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State?
I don't know.
Do
that
not.
one.
Oh my God! As little as we've known each other, and I have a sense for your personality, I have a strong sense.
And I'm ordering it now. Yes, go ahead.
I have a strong sense this will blow your fucking minds. This. I just had a class on data, and this is about the history of large-scale states and institutions. And I put this in the middle of my class, and my entire class, when we got to it, went completely apeshit. They were like, "It has changed my world." Okay. Here's the basic view for Scott. Scott is a historian and an anthropologist, and his specialty is actually agricultural history. So here's the way he puts it. He says state. So states, he means any kind of large-scale institutional bureaucracy. So that includes governments, but it also includes corporations and large-scale capitalism. All these kind of states for him. So states can only see the parts of the world that are put into a format that can be processed at scale. So standardized categories, quantification. So here's the way he puts it. Certain parts of the world easily admit of quantified measurement. Those are legible to the state. Other parts of the world are so variable and locally variable that they do not admit of ready institutional measurement. Those parts are illegible to the state. The state can't see it, and so it can't act there, right? Because it can't information process. That's kind of what we've established so far. What he says, the second part is, therefore, states have a motive to remake the world, to make it more legible to them, such that they can see more completely into the world. And the entire book is a history of this book, Seeing Like a State, is a catalog of different ways this happens. So it's everything from he starts with a story about how the German scientific forestry movement reduced the ecological diversity of the German forest in order to make it more measurable and to make plank yields more trackable. There are stories about how cities that often were labyrinths were remade into grids because grids are more legible to the state. You can take a soldier from anywhere and put them in a grid city and they can navigate it, so it makes them more easily policed. One of these key cases is about how property rules used to be really, really variable and often very context sensitive. So a property rule might have been something like, look, this area is mostly for this one person, but sometimes during drought years, everyone can use the water here. And also those people, their cows can graze on right? But that's very, very illegible to the state. So the state tends to introduce very simple landholding rules. Like one entity holds everything, right? You don't get these sliders. He also has a whole history about how he thinks state legibility is the explanation for monocultures, where you try to create like a very similar type of soil across the landscape so you can plant things in a similar way using centrally organized policies. I think Scott is incredibly right about a lot of this stuff. And in answer to Helen's question from, 20 minutes ago, another way to imagine the forces we're seeing here are, first, state level forces want to make the world more legible. And second, this is what I've been thinking about. A lot of the times I think we internalize the state way of thinking. And what that looks like is a student not thinking what matters to me, what's interesting, but thinking what will get me a grade, right? That's an academic thinking, not what's interesting, but what will get me the most publications, the most citation rates, right? That's a journalist not thinking what matters to the world, but what will get me the most page views. So we're often internalizing. So this is a paper I'm writing right now. We're internalizing a measure which is built for large scale use. And what we've already seen is that such measures have to pass through filter gates that remove nuance, remove contextual sensitivity, and remove and I mean, what this looks like to me is the experience. So I used to be like this for exercise, right? My measures for successful exercise were calories burned, weight lost. Those are all, it wasn't like, how does my body feel? Was this activity aesthetically rich? Those are not things that are state legible measures. So I think there's this thing that's going on where we get sucked in to this decontextualizing process, and we kind of like imbibe it, and that's how we see ourselves.
When you said that, sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm not being very womanly, am I? But when I read that in your paper, I actually had this grand metacognitive moment where I suddenly realized that a lot of this Apple Watch, which is so useful and I really do like it, but that I was starting to trade off certain aspects of enjoying and exercise enjoyment to fast get it done targets. And some days that's fine. Fast get it done targets on days where you're busy, but that's fine. But when you've got time and you choose, instead of, for me, mountain biking or skiing, instead of doing something that's really pleasurable like that for 2 hours, that I'd rather work really hard on the spin bike for half an hour just to get those things done sooner. That was like, why am I doing that? I don't even want to do that. And it made me think about how much you're totally right. It's almost like the more the metrics are pushed out by the state, by institutions, by the watch, whatever, the more we bind with them and accept them, the less I think about them and the more I just choose them. They just become, I'm programmed. Stop deliberating about them.
Yeah, I mean, this is why thinking about games is so useful to me, because games, I think, are the flip side of this. I mean, I'm not sure if your audience, you know this, but I'm not sure your audience knows this. I got into this stuff. So I'm supposed to be trained as a social epistemologist thinking about knowledge, and I also do aesthetics, which interesting, I think, are very similar categories. Aesthetics is the philosophy of art. And so I've been working on this long project on the nature of games, and that's how I kind of backed into this. I was thinking about games, and I started thinking about gamification. And one of the incredible pleasures of games for me is this experience of total value, simplicity, and clarity and absorption. And the first worry I had was when you apply that simplifying force to something else, like Twitter, you're kind of screwing with it. But now I think something even deeper is going on, and it's really connected to what you were talking about. Okay, maybe I can start with the story, and then I'll back up into the philosophy. So my pandemic hobby that I picked up was fly fishing, because you can do that outside. I was a climber, and early days of the pandemic, like when it's winter here, the climbing gyms are pretty crowded. Don't want to go there. I had to do something else, so I learned to fly fish. So fly fishing is a stupid thing to do with your time. It's definitely a game, right? Let me just be clear.
A low yield game too.
It's a really low yield game. Okay. So, Bernard Suits, the philosopher of games, whose book, The Grasshopper, was a major inspiration for me, gives the following definition of a game. He says, playing a game is voluntarily taking on obstacles to make possible the activity of struggling to overcome them. So in a sense, like what a game is you take on some obstacles because you want to have those obstacles, right? So one way to put it is that in a game, the obstacles are kind of integral to the point. Like if you run a marathon and then you like sneakily call a cab in the middle, you didn't like, do the marathon better. You failed to run the marathon, right? What it is to cross the finish line of a marathon is to have done it inside the constraints. And what that means for Suits is the constraints are part of what makes it valuable. So for me, in my book on games, I said that what Suits showed me is there's this deep category of game playing that I want to call striving play. So distinguish between two categories of play: achievement play and striving play. Achievement play is playing for the value of winning. Striving play is temporarily taking on an interest in winning for the sake of the struggle. So fancy way of saying the journey is the destination, right? I'm a rock climber. I try to get to the top of the rock, not because it matters to be up there, because I'm just going to lower off when I get there. It's that taking on that goal creates this interesting, rich activity. But I think sometimes people get it the wrong ass way around. The point of a game is you throw yourself at an end because the activity is interesting, because it's valuable, because it's rich. But if you just get obsessed with the points and forget to make sure the activity is worthwhile, then you've lost the meaning in the game. So fly fishing is really interesting because it is definitely the stupidest way to fish. Fishing with bait and other kinds of fishing are much, much easier. Fly fishing is you're trying to get something to bite an imitation bug that you yourself have tied. It's stupid. But there's ways of fly fishing. So the way that I and a lot of people prefer is called dry fly fishing. I don't know if you fly fish before, but that's when you get the little bug floating on the top and the trout sucks it off the surface and it's hard as hell. You have to cast a mosquito imitation 40 feet away and land it on the size of a teacup to get the fish to take it. But it's really interesting. You end up staring at the river, out in the river all day long. And sometimes you don't catch any fish, but you've been staring at the surface of water, standing in water, doing this beautiful activity. I remember one time I was at the fly fishing river and I saw this guy there and he was just over and he looked angry. And he had a clicker on him and he was clicking the number of fish he caught. And I said, "How you doing, man?" And he said, "I'm just not where I want to be. I've only caught 5 fish. I'm failing my goals." And I'm like, "The fuck are you doing? Why are you what? You're not even eating the fish. It's catch and release, man." The point of fishing is to be engaged in a beautiful activity and having spiritual and mental renewal on a river. And here's this guy completely miserable, right? Because he's not making his numbers. And to me, this is, I think it's kind of a internalization of a certain bureaucratic capitalist mindset where all that matters is the outcome. And you've lost what the thing is about, right? The points aren't the point. The points are there to help you have an interesting time. And so if I feel like I'm just barfing stuff at you, but somewhere between the simplicity of gamification, how metrics lose context at scale, and the way that we get so easily obsessed with point systems, where those point systems in fly fishing, the point systems measure either the number of fish you caught or the weight of the fish. They don't measure your pleasure or your joy at being on the river or a sense of I went fly fishing yesterday after I finished grading, and the best part, I caught 1 fish, but I saw 3 beavers just swimming by, right, looking at me. It was amazing, right? But I feel like I'm building to a grand climax, and I don't have a grand climax. But there's something about this experience that internalizes this external outcome-oriented scaled process that I feel is killing meaning and joy.
Sure. It totally is. The story that you tell about fishing yesterday, or whatever it was, is about the beavers. It's not about the fish, right? And I'm having memories of a river runs through it, kind of tickling on. That's not about, a fish clicker. And when you're talking about college and education and what your classes you're choosing and how many papers am I going to publish, there's sort of there's a fish clicker aspect to, well, if I take these courses, it's going to make me more employable because of whatever metrics are going to be analyzed now by the AI recruiting algorithm that's going to look at my college transcript and my resume to make sure that I've got enough clicks on there. And I wonder whether you feel like this has changed over time. I'm tapping into your you didn't end up in an historian, but I'm gonna throw some history question at you. Has this changed over time? I reflect back on the difference in generations between our children and us. At least I felt like when I went through college, I was taking classes because they were the ones that just kind of interested me, and I happened along a path into being, my major and et cetera, et cetera. but I wasn't sitting there thinking about the clicking, because maybe there wasn't the same measurement there for me to be obsessed by. But it feels like the current generation is now going through college with an expectation of where they're clicking, versus just the enjoyment of the class, the pursuit of some crazy new, idea. Do you feel like that's a fair assessment, that it's something that's changed over time?
I both want to say it's an old problem and one that's accelerating. So I think there are some people who are like, this is a new problem. This is the problem of AI. It's a 10-year-old problem. And I'm like, hell no, right?
No.
This is a problem.
Metrification, maybe. Yeah,
metrification has been on the steady rise for 300 years. But what we're seeing is greater and greater consolidation of metrics, right? So, in some sense, this is a problem that, I'm seeing stuff from the 19th century that's making these same points. And the points are things like, you can see this in the early literature on factories and saying that, what factories are doing is getting people obsessed with these standard outcomes and just thinking about upping the numbers. This is the 19th century, right? So we've seen this stuff around. There's Albert Borgman is this great philosopher of technology. And he has this idea that what technology is doing is moving us towards this thing he calls the device paradigm. And the device paradigm is a device is something that disconnects you from the process of getting to the outcome and just focuses on the outcome. So here's this example about the wood stove. The wood stove is this thing that if you're actually running a wood stove, you're often like gathering the wood, which involves attention to the forest, or you're talking to people and you're managing your forest pile, and you're like, right? It produces a certain attentiveness to the social and natural world. He says the device is the air conditioner, central air. You flick it, your money goes down, warm air appears out of nowhere. You have no particular relationship to the procedure. So Borgman, by the way, says he got a lot of the stuff from Heidegger. So that's right. That's an older thing. I do think what we're seeing is, so there's this really interesting paper called Making the Grade it's a James Scott style history of the American grading scheme. And one of the things they say is, in early American education, we actually used rankings based on, we based ourselves on this German model of you get people to compete. And we figured out in the early 19th century that this was destroying education and students were just focused on the rankings. So the early 19th century, we moved away from it towards more qualitative evaluation procedures. And then around the 1850s, we started shifting in the other direction because of the pressures for standardized certificates. So what you want is, you want a standardized certificate. So if someone hires someone with a BA in CS, they know the kinds of skills that person. It creates a certain employee fungibility where you can just quickly trade around units of employees. So there's a thing that starts in the 1850s. But I think one of the things we see is more and more, instead of a number of decentralized metrics, we're seeing more and more a movement towards a centralization of a metric that makes, again, here's something we've seen in our lifetime. There were bestseller, or there were record charts for the hits in music, but still, to consume music, most of the time I went to a different music store and I talked to someone and I got someone's different opinion. So one of the more interesting things I've seen, some of the more interesting research I've seen has said something like, you would have thought that Spotify would have made our collective listening more varied, but it hasn't. Instead, most people listen to whatever is on the top of the current algorithm and what shows up as the recommended things on the top page. Same thing has happened for social media and the consumption of information. Social media has generally decreased the kind of information. So different people are no longer reading different things. They're mostly reading the same things, whatever gets trended each week. So one of the things to worry about is the channels for our attention are getting narrower and narrower. I just read this truly terrifying paper from a technology ethicist named Catherine Creel called The Algorithmic Monolith. And one of the things she points out is that it's not just that HR companies are using algorithmic hiring device algorithms for hiring. It's that they're using the same one, and it's not. I mean, there are a few different. It turns out that there are a few different companies selling HR algorithm tools, but they're based on the same core algorithm that was trained on the same data set, which means, says Creel, that there's this new possibility where before one company might decide that you're no good, but another company might be into you. But if you fail to hit whatever this one algorithm is looking for, you will get no jobs, right?
Yeah, then you're totally out. I saw something similar recently about research that said 12 global companies are responsible for, I think, they use 50% of the data sets. Like it's just this level of concentration, this power law thing that also happens on the flip side of scale. It's not like the scale gives us scale diversity across scale. It actually just flip side just concentrates it.
Yes, this is what Scott says at the end of Seeing Like a State. What he says is that, so he has this incredible story about how different farmers used to be expert in their local ecosystems. And the procedure of monocropping means that we change we fertilize fields to make them similar, and then we figure out in a few agricultural labs what the best technique is, and we push that out. And he says what this does is it de-skills individual farmers. Individual farmers are no longer experts on their local environment because in some sense we've destroyed the locality of the environment. We've made everything similar. And here's the key. He says we've concentrated skill and autonomy in a very small number of people, in a small number of agricultural scientists and policymakers. So I think you're exactly right. The thing that's really worrying here is a way, I mean, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be that algorithms lead to the consolidation of power, right? You could have had a billion algorithms, but the algorithms we have. So I should just say this. I have a lot of worries, and none of these are worries about algorithms in principle. They're worries about AI models that we see in this world as trained by institutions as we use them. What we see is this mass consolidation, exactly what you say, right? You see this filtering effect where everything gets squeezed through this tiny information pipeline, and then somehow fed out to the rest of us, and we feed it up, and we think, oh, what makes me valuable as a human being is my GPA or my salary or my citation rate.
Yeah, the algorithms are optimized for the state according to the metrics and that that they're driven by, or that they want to drive.
Yeah.
Which makes it a very narrow in, narrow out almost.
Yep. And let me say one more thing. This is crucial from Scott. One of the things that makes Scott interesting to me is that, so a lot of people, when they go through this similar train, will say, oh, it's capitalism. This is capitalist logic. Scott actually alternates examples from large-scale capitalism and from centralized communism. And he claims that it's actually an information processing problem, that the problem is scale, and that global capital markets and centralized communist bureaucracies. Let me say that again, not communism or social in general, but as run with a centralized decision-making bureaucratic apparatus, have the same problem that shows up in different ways of having to compress large amounts of information into either reports for a central bureaucracy or price information. And both
so
of
it's
that,
efficiency as well. Is it efficiency of the use of information and efficiency of it's hard. It's not efficient to serve a really diverse population. Like if you're just going for efficiency, right, you want one kind of human to serve. The most expensive people to serve in a social system are those that have the most diverse needs. Right. They're the ones that end up with being underserved, perpetually underserved.
One of the terrifying things from Scott is that if you absorb it, you can get to this one place by thinking of a completely evil capitalist machine, but you can also get there by thinking of a completely benevolent centralized bureaucracy that just wants to maximize its citizens' happiness. But as you say, it's easier to maximize citizen happiness if they have lower variation. And so even the good-minded, the charitable state, insofar as it's a state, has a reason to want reduced variability?
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and it's going to lead me to spend the afternoon in a way that will not show up by any metric as productivity, because I'm going to have to lie down and close my eyes and just kind of think through some of this, which will be valuable in a way that cannot be quantified, and will not be any way that I could be measured in any scale effect. No, but in all seriousness, this is, I hope we get to do this again at some point, because I feel like there's about 6 or 8 different threads that I wish we had gone down, different branches that we passed on our single pathway in the conversation here. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating, and we hope to stay in touch and do this again someday.
Thanks for having me. It's been a good time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe on Substack or your favorite podcast platform. And please leave a positive rating or comment. Sharing your positive feedback helps us reach more people and connect them with the world's great minds. Seriously, a review on Apple Podcasts is a big deal. And if you like how we think, then contact us about our speaking and workshops and human-centered product design. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com, and you can contact us at hello@getsonder.com. You can learn more about making better decisions in our book, Make Better Decisions: How to Improve Your Decision-Making in the Digital Age. The book is an essential guide to practicing the cognitive skills needed for making better decisions in the age of data, algorithms, and AI. Please check it out at mbd.zone, on Amazon, bookshop.org, or place an order through your favorite local bookstore.
Solid state.